Database compare for relational databases is a mature area. There are products like Redgate SQL Compare, and Microsoft's product is called Schema Compare, which comes with SQL Server Data Tools. I use these products quite a lot, and my only frustration with them is that I, as an analysis services practitioner, would like some of that functionality for analysis services, which is why I built BISM Normalizer. At a basic level, we can use it to reuse definitions between tabular models. In an enterprise organization, there could be multiple data warehouses, data marts, cubes, tabular models. So how do we avoid reinventing the wheel every time we create a new tabular model, given that there will be a significant overlap in terms of the business definitions covered by those models in many cases? So we can use it to help promote a single version of the truth in that respect. We can also use it for migration from Power Pivots to analysis services. Many of you may have seen the Microsoft demos where a Power Pivot model supposedly gets very popular, and IT then want to take ownership of that model. They will then import from Power Pivot into analysis services, which is very straightforward. But what then? We're kind of stuck at that point. Are we supposed to have a separate analysis services database for each Power Pivot migration? What we really want to do is take the Power Pivot migrated model and merge it into the relevant corporate BI model to help bridge the gap between self-service and corporate BI. We can also use it for branching and merging a code base for parallel development. Not the type of thing you need every day, but if you do need it, you may have a very strong use case for this. And as an analysis services practitioner, we're basically out of luck. There is practically no way to do a merge in analysis services without BISM Normalizer. Another variation of this use case is we can only have one developer on a project at a time because there's one BIM file for the whole project in Visual Studio. With BISM Normalizer, allow multiple developers to work in parallel and merge the changes when they're done. We can also use it to track differences between tabular models. What really is the state of the tabular models on the development, test, user acceptance test, and production servers? Has someone sneaked in some functionality that we're not aware of, or just as a sanity check? And then we've got deployment, which is a fairly big area. So when we deploy our tabular models, and really I'm talking about the fairly large tabular models, if your tabular model only takes 5 minutes to reprocess, that's not such a big deal. You can go ahead and drop and recreate it every time you do a deployment. But for a large tabular model, we may not want to do that. Just like when we deploy a new version of a data warehouse, we don't drop and recreate the data warehouse. We'll instead package up a deployment and bring the schema up to the latest version while still maintaining the data within the data warehouse. So the same concept applies to tabular models, or at least large tabular models. So the tables in the tabular model that we would really like to not have to rebuild and reprocess are obviously going to be the big ones, or the partitioned ones, which is the only reason to do partitioning in tabular is to speed up processing times. So those partition objects are important with regard to deployment. And in the vast majority of cases, they will not exist in the version of the tabular model in source control because they are generally created and managed by the ETL to implement a rolling window pattern or something like that. So we can't just open up the project in Visual Studio, right-click deploy to one of the target servers. If we do that, the partition objects will disappear and all the data within those big tables will vanish. All right? So we need a deployment method that supports this retain partitions functionality. And there are actually lots of other objects that we may want to retain in the target as well. For example, roles. Roles could be very different on production compared to the lower environments. We don't want to have to script out the creation of those roles, or alternatively connections. Connections quite often point to different instances of the source databases in the tabular model, depending on which environment we're looking at. So there are various objects that we may just not want to mess with as part of the deployment. And there are only two deployment methods for tabular models that support this retain objects functionality, being BISM Normalizer and the Analysis Services Deployment Wizard. Now, the Deployment Wizard, to be fair, it hasn't been enhanced in almost 10 years since Analysis Services 2005, but it does serve a useful purpose, primarily because you can run it from a command line. And by the way, it would be very easy for me to allow BISM Normalizer to be run from a command line as well, and I probably intend to do that at a later date. But the deployment wizard, it's not really going to add so much value running it in graphical mode. You're going to probably run it from a command line, and the point is that it takes extra effort to set up. For it to really add value, you might set up a TFS build that's going to automate building the project in Visual Studio to generate the AS database file. Then you're going to write a command to execute the deployment wizard, parameterizing it with the AS database file, and it just takes some extra effort to set up. And in my personal experience, most of the projects I've seen have not gone to the trouble of setting up the deployment wizard. For those projects, or maybe they just haven't got around to setting up yet, BISM Normalizer can very easily generate an XMLA script to be associated with the release. Now, let's just say for a moment that a project has set up the deployment wizard, at least for the scheduled releases to test and production, which might happen every couple of months. Even if that's the case, there are still some pretty big gaps that the deployment wizard does not fill. For example, deployment to the development server during the development process. If I'm a developer, I'm developing on my developer workstation, which is normally where my workspace database is going to reside. And for an enterprise tabular model, that might require 30, 40, 50 gigabytes of memory. That's simply not going to fit on my local developer workstation laptop. The workspace database is basically redundant in an enterprise development scenario. So I need to deploy to the development server practically every 5 minutes. Every time I add a measure or modify a measure or make any modeling enhancements, I need to deploy to the development server. And also my development reports are going to be pointing at the development server, not at the workspace database. Now, I want to deploy to the development server from Visual Studio. It doesn't make sense to use the deployment wizard in that use case. And I also want to retain partitions on the development server because I want to make sure my partitioning code is working before I deploy it, and I want development to match up with test and production as much as possible. So that's a pretty big use case. Many of you may have heard of another third-party free tool for analysis services called BIDS Helper. And BIDS Helper has a bit of functionality for multidimensional that serves a very similar purpose, which is deploy MDX script. For multidimensional projects, we can deploy new versions of calculations to the development server and still maintain partitions and anything else that we want to maintain there. But obviously, BISM Normalizer is for tabular. It doesn't work on multidimensional. Okay, and then we've got another big use case, which is bug fixes and partial deployments. And organizations are going to approach this differently. So we've all been there. We've all been in a situation where we need to do a partial deployment, or maybe we've got a bug fix on production. We need to deploy the new versions of a couple of measures, and we don't want to have to wait for the next full release cycle. Now, the deployment wizard is not going to work here because it's an all or nothing committal. We can't just script out a couple of measures for a partial deployment and keep the rest of the functionality that we're still working on in our development environment, which hasn't been tested and is not ready to go till the next scheduled release. Right? So BISM Normalizer is very good at just taking the subset of the model that we want to deploy as part of a partial deployment or for a bug fix that needs to be deployed. Now, some organizations will set up a production branch in TFS specifically to address production bug fixes. Even if our organization has gone to the trouble of setting that up, which in my experience most have not, but even if we have a production branch, we're still going to want BISM Normalizer to merge those bug fixes back to the main development branch, or we're going to be doing the same bug fix in two different places, which is not ideal either. Time for a quick demo. It really doesn't take very long to demo at all. So this will be my source project, which has these currency tables. And I want to reuse these currency tables for my target project, which is called this corporate model. And as you can see, they don't exist there. Having installed BISM Normalizer, I get this Compare Tabular Models toolbar button. And before I run the comparison, there are a couple of options I'd like to call out here. So firstly, we need to leave this include partitions in table definitions unchecked if we're going to get that retain partitions functionality I was talking about, where the tables will be considered equal because the columns are the same, the data types are the same, the formatting and the calculated columns are all the same, without considering the fact that the target table may have 20 partitions and the source may have just one. And another thing I want to point out here is that BISM Normalizer supports actions, display folders, and translations. So the tabular model designer in Visual Studio, which it inherited from Power Pivot, does not allow us to create actions, display folders, and translations. So we have to use the tool which I mentioned earlier called BIDS Helper. And having installed BIDS Helper, we're able to create those using these menu items here. And we can then use BISM Normalizer to manage and deploy those objects. So the source and target can be either a project or a database, and if we're deploying to the development server as part of the development process, we would specify it here. But in this case, I'm going to keep the source and target as projects. We're going to run the comparison, and these are the currency objects we want to reuse in the target. It supports all of the tabular model designer objects, being tables, relationships, measures, KPIs, connections, partitions, perspectives, roles, and even the BIDS helper created objects, which I just mentioned. In this scenario where we are reusing objects from one model to another, the target model might be a mature corporate model. The source may have been a Power Pivot migrated prototype or something. So there could be lots of objects in the target where that we just don't want to mess with. There could be hundreds of objects that we don't want to mess with. So rather than coming into all of these which are missing in source and skipping them all individually, we can instead skip all objects missing in source, and with a couple of clicks they all get skipped. Then we have internet sales, and that's got different definitions with an update action item because ship date key is in the source but not the target. We'll leave that. And for whatever reason, we don't want to push these objects through, so we'll go ahead and skip those. We can now hide skip objects to focus on the differences, validate the selection. It's going to tell us what it's going to do and give us warnings for name conflicts and things like that. We can report differences to an Excel file. We can script the changes to be associated with a release or as a partial deployment or bug fix. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and commit the changes straight to the target project. Once it refreshes, we should see the currency objects in the source and the target. And there they are. And internet sales now has the same definition because ship date key is in the source and the target. And everything else that we skipped is still listed as a difference. I'll now open the target model, and we should be able to see the currency tables in there. There they are. Switch to diagram view. We can see them there as well. So as you can see, it's a very easy to use tool. In terms of my future plans for BISM Normalizer, I'd like to enhance it to allow saving the comparison to a file, after which the user can reopen that comparison and the selections will of course be persisted. Another use case for saving to a comparison file will be that we can run BISM Normalizer in command line mode, passing the comparison file as a parameter, and that will better support automated builds and deployments. Thank you very much for watching this video.